She arrived in a dead woman's town, carrying a dead woman's name on a stranger's lips. The moment Clara Whitmore stepped off that stagecoach, she saw it in their eyes, every face lining the dusty street of Red Hollow. Pity, contempt, the quiet satisfaction of people watching someone walk straight into a trap. The man waiting for her hadn't shaved in weeks. He didn't smile, didn't tip his hat. He just looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he ordered out of necessity. And in that single terrible moment, Clara understood exactly what she was. A replacement. If you're watching this from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay until the very end, hit that like button, and let's begin. The stagecoach from Abilene took 4 days. 4 days of rattling bones and swallowed dust. 4 days of sitting wedged between a traveling merchant who smelled like wet leather and an elderly woman who prayed under her breath every time the wheels hit a rock. 4 days of watching the landscape outside the window transform from something recognizable. Rolling green hills, farmhouses with white fences, church steeples catching the afternoon sun, into something rawer and harder and entirely indifferent to human comfort. By the time the wheels ground to a stop in Red Hollow, Clara Whitmore had eaten the last of the biscuits she'd packed in Abilene, had lost feeling in her left foot twice, and had rehearsed what she intended to say to Ezekiel Hale approximately 47 times. She'd imagined it going a dozen different ways. None of them went the way it actually did. The town materialized out of the dust like a half-finished thought. One main street, a general store with a crooked awning, a saloon already loud at 3 in the afternoon, a blacksmith's forge sending smoke into the pale October sky, 2 women standing on the wooden boardwalk outside the dry goods store, arms folded, watching the stagecoach with the particular attention of people who had very little else to occupy their afternoons. Clara pressed her face briefly to the window glass and took inventory. Smaller than I expected, she thought. Then, stop! You don't get to be disappointed. She pulled her bag down from the overhead rack before the merchant could offer to help her, straightened her coat, the gray wool one she'd bought with the last of her father's money, the one that was already showing wear at the cuffs, and stepped down onto the street. The air hit her like a physical thing, cold and dry, and carrying the smell of manure, wood smoke, and something else she couldn't name, something mineral and open. The smell, she would later decide, of a place that didn't care whether you survived it. She stood on the street with her carpetbag at her feet and looked around. That was when she saw him. He was leaning against the post outside the land registry office, arms crossed, watching her with the flat patience of a man waiting for a delayed supply wagon rather than a person. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders. His coat was good quality but neglected, a button missing near the collar, mud dried along the hem. He had dark hair shot through with gray at the temples, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in what looked like the better part of 2 weeks. He was 41 years old. She knew that from the letters. He looked older. The women on the boardwalk had gone very quiet. Clara picked up her carpetbag, squared her shoulders in the way her mother had taught her, back straight, chin level, never let them see you swallow, and walked toward him. She stopped about 4 feet away. The polite distance. The distance you kept from someone you didn't yet have the right to stand closer to. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was lower than she'd imagined from his letters. The letters, she now realized, had been written by a man trying to be something on paper that he didn't particularly feel in his body. "You're shorter than I expected." She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Your letter said you were of average height." "I am of average height." He pushed off the post and picked up her carpetbag before she could stop him, not as a gesture of warmth, but with the brisk efficiency of a man completing a task on a list. "Wagons around back. We've got about 2 hours of daylight left, and I'd rather not be on the ridge road after dark." He was already walking. Clara stood on the street for 3 full seconds, watching his back, before she started after him. Behind her, she heard one of the women on the boardwalk say something in a low voice, and the other one laugh, a short, clipped sound that had nothing kind in it. She didn't turn around. The wagon ride to the Hale Ranch took 40 minutes, and Ezekiel spoke perhaps 20 words during the entire journey. He told her the ranch was 6 miles northeast of town. He told her that the woman who had been cooking and cleaning since his wife died, a widow named Mrs. Pratt, had left 3 weeks ago to go live with her daughter in Colorado. He told her that the children's names were Caleb, age 12, and Emily, age 6. He said the last part in the careful tone of a man reciting facts he'd already decided to deliver without inflection. Clara sat on the wagon bench beside him, with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the country opening up around them. The land was extraordinary in the way that brutal things sometimes are. Flat-bottomed valleys giving way to sudden ridges of red and orange rock, cottonwood trees along a dry creek bed, their leaves turning the color of old coins. The sky so enormous and so empty that it made the chest feel tight. "Your children," she said, after about 15 minutes of silence. "Do they know I'm coming?" A pause. "They know?" "Do they know why I'm coming?" Another pause, longer. "Caleb does. Emily's too young for the details." "What did you tell Caleb?" Ezekiel's jaw shifted slightly. "I told him I needed help running the house, and that you'd agreed to come." Clara thought about that. "Did you tell him it was a marriage arrangement?" "He's 12. He worked it out." "And how did he take that information?" The silence that followed that question was its own kind of answer. Clara nodded slowly. She looked back at the road. A hawk was circling something in the valley below, patient, unhurried, completely certain of its own purpose. She watched it for a while. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I want to be honest with you about something." "All right. I didn't come here because I had no other options." It was a small lie, but she told it with enough conviction that she almost believed it herself. "I came because I thought this could be a real arrangement between two people willing to work at it. I'm not expecting anything romantic. I'm not expecting you to feel things you don't feel, but I'm expecting to be treated like a person rather than a piece of furniture you ordered from a catalog." The hawk dropped out of the sky. She watched it disappear behind the ridge. Ezekiel said nothing for a long time. Then, "That's fair." It wasn't warm. It wasn't a promise of anything. But it was, she supposed, a start. Wouldn't. The ranch was worse than she'd been prepared for. She didn't say that. She got down from the wagon, looked at the house. A long, low structure of weathered timber with a porch that sagged noticeably on the left side. And she kept her face carefully neutral while something in her chest did a complicated thing it would take her several days to fully identify. It wasn't horror. It wasn't quite despair. It was closer to the feeling of looking at a very sick animal and trying to calculate, honestly, whether it was recoverable. The yard was mud and dead grass. A fence post on the south side had fallen over and hadn't been righted. The front window had a crack running diagonally across the lower pane, patched with a strip of cloth that had since come partially loose and was flapping in the evening wind. 2 chickens wandered freely across the porch with the confident energy of animals that had not been told they were trespassing. A ranch hand she would later learn was named Hector appeared from the direction of the barn, nodded at her without particular interest, and asked Ezekiel something in a low voice about the horses. Emily appeared in the doorway of the house. She was small even for 6, a slight, serious child with dark hair cut bluntly across her forehead and her father's exact stillness. She was wearing a dress that was clean but too small, the hem sitting several inches above her ankles. She stood in the doorway and looked at Clara without a word. Clara walked up the porch steps, careful of the sag on the left, and stopped in front of the little girl. "Hi," she said. "You must be Emily. My name's Clara." Emily studied her with the unblinking assessment that young children apply to things that interest or worry them. "Are you going to live here now?" "I am, yes." "Do you know how to make biscuits?" Clara blinked. Then, almost against her will, she felt the corner of her mouth move. "I do." Emily seemed to consider this information with great seriousness. Then she stepped aside from the doorway, just barely, in what was apparently an invitation. Clara carried her carpetbag inside. The interior of the house smelled like old fire and neglect, and something underneath both of those things. Something that might once have been lavender. An old smell. A woman's smell. Still clinging to the curtains and the wooden furniture despite whatever had been done to try to rid the place of it, or despite the fact that nothing had been done at all. There was a stone fireplace in the main room, unlit. A table with 4 chairs, one of which had a crack along the back leg held together with a length of rope. Shelves along the east wall carrying a collection of tins and jars and a few books. A spinning wheel in the corner that was thick with dust. Clara stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, taking inventory the way her mother had taught her. Not to be overwhelmed, but to understand the scope of the problem before you decided what to do about it. The problem was considerable. "Your room is through there." Ezekiel had come in behind her, and he gestured toward a short hallway. "Second door, it was—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "It's clean. Thank you." He set her bag down just inside the hallway entrance. He didn't go further. "Supper's usually at 6. I can put something together tonight, or—" "I'll cook," Clara said. He looked at her. Something moved briefly in his expression, not gratitude exactly, more like relief that he didn't have to negotiate a direction for the evening. "The pantry's off the kitchen," he said. Then he went back outside. Clara stood in the quiet house, listening to his boots cross the porch and descend the steps. She stood there for a full minute after the sound of him faded. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to find the pantry. Caleb didn't come in for supper. Ezekiel said nothing about it. He sat at the head of the table with Emily beside him, and they ate the salt pork and beans Clara had put together from what little the pantry offered. And the silence was the particular kind that exists not because there is nothing to say, but because nobody has yet figured out how to say any of it. Emily ate with methodical seriousness. She cleaned her plate without being asked, and then looked at Clara and said, "These are good beans." "Thank you, Emily." "Caleb doesn't like beans. Most people come around to them eventually." "He really doesn't," Emily said, as if she felt obligated to be accurate about this. Ezekiel ate without speaking. He ate the way a man eats when eating is a necessity rather than a pleasure. Efficiently, without looking at his food, his eyes somewhere on the middle distance. Twice Clara caught him glancing toward the window, toward the dark outside, toward wherever Caleb was that wasn't at this table. After supper, Clara washed the dishes. She was on the last pot when she heard the back door open and close, heard boots crossing the kitchen floor, heard them stop. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished the pot, dried her hands on the cloth by the basin, and then turned. Caleb Hale was 12 years old and already building toward his father's height and his father's expression. He had lighter coloring than Ezekiel. His dead mother in his face, she would realize later, once she'd seen the portrait on the bedroom wall. But the jaw set the same way, the same deliberate stillness that in a grown man read as restraint, and in a 12-year-old read as a door held shut by both hands from the inside. He looked at her the way she imagined he had probably looked at everything that came into this house since his mother died, measuring it, deciding how much damage it could do. "You're the woman my father sent for," he said. "I'm Clara," she said. "I know what your name is." She let that sit for a moment. "Are you hungry? There's beans and pork left on the— I ate in the bunkhouse." "Okay?" "I want you to know," he said, with the particular awful dignity that some children carry when they have had to grow up too fast, "that I'm not going to pretend I know what this is, and I don't think it's right." Clara looked at him steadily. "What do you think it is?" "You're here because my father needs someone to keep the house. He needed someone, so he paid to bring you here." His voice was flat and certain, the voice of a boy who had rehearsed this. "But my mother lived in this house. She raised me in this house, and you're not her, and I'm not going to act like you are." The silence that followed had weight. Clara said, "I agree with you." He blinked. He had not expected that. "I'm not your mother," she said. "I'm never going to be your mother, and I'm not going to try to be. I came here to keep this house running and to try to make things a little easier for your family, and whether you think that's right or wrong is something you're allowed to feel. But I want to be honest with you, because you seem like someone who appreciates honesty." She paused. "I'm scared too. This isn't easy for me either." Caleb stared at her. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word, his footsteps crossing the main room, ascending the stairs, a door closing above. Not a slam. Just a door closing. Clara turned back to the sink, braced both hands on the edge of it, and stared at the window glass and the dark outside it for a long moment. Then she dried the last pot, put it on the shelf, and went to find her room. The room that had been prepared for her was small and cold, and contained a narrow bed with a wool quilt, a wooden dresser with a cracked mirror above it, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the north pasture. She sat on the edge of the bed with her carpet bag between her feet and didn't unpack it. Not yet. She wasn't ready to unpack it. Unpacking it would mean committing to this room in a way she wasn't quite prepared for at 9 o'clock on her first night. Instead, she opened the bag and took out the photograph. It was the only one she had, a small, formal portrait of her parents taken sometime in the 1850s, both of them stiff and serious in the way people were when photographs were solemn occasions. Her mother in her Sunday dress, her father in his collar, which he had clearly found uncomfortable. Both of them were dead now. Her mother from fever 3 years ago, her father from a fall from a horse 18 months after that, leaving behind the photograph $43, a reputation for excellent horsemanship, and a daughter who had spent the following year surviving on the charity of distant relatives who made the nature of their charity very clear. She propped the photograph against the lamp on the dresser. She could hear the wind outside picking up, rattling the glass in the window frame. From somewhere in the barn, a horse made a low, unhappy sound. She thought about the list she'd made in Abilene on the last night in the boarding house there before she boarded the stagecoach, a list of what she was willing to do and what she wasn't, what she would endure and what she wouldn't. The kind of list you make when you need to feel like you have some control over a situation that is fundamentally outside your control. I will work hard, she had written. I will not be treated like I am invisible. I will not pretend to feel things I don't feel. I will not spend the rest of my life apologizing for being here. She read the list over in her head now, sitting in this cold room in this dark house in this hard country, and she decided that all of it still held. She got up, unpacked her bag, put her few dresses in the dresser, set her boots by the door, and got into bed. The wind kept at the window for a long time before she finally slept. She was up before dawn, not because she couldn't sleep, though that was also true, because she had already decided, somewhere in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, that the way you survived inside a house that didn't want you was to make yourself useful before anyone could argue that you weren't. She dressed in the dark, tied her hair back, and went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. She had the fire going in 20 minutes. She had grown up building fires. This was not a skill she needed to be taught. She had water on to heat and was working out the bread dough by the time the sky outside the kitchen window began its slow gray transition toward light. Hector appeared at the back door at 5:30, evidently looking for coffee. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, took in the lit stove and the smell of bread, and something in his weathered face shifted into something that wasn't quite surprise. "Morning," Clara said. "Morning," he said. He was a compact, dark-haired man in his mid-50s, she guessed, with a mustache that had more gray in it than anything else. He had the careful eyes of a man who had seen quite a lot and learned to withhold his opinions until they were necessary. "Didn't expect to see anyone in here." "Coffee's about 10 minutes out." He nodded slowly. "Much obliged." He stayed in the doorway, not quite coming in. "You sleep all right?" "Fine, thank you. House makes noise in the wind. First couple nights it takes some getting used to." "I noticed." He looked at the bread dough. Something crossed his face, something she couldn't entirely read. Then he said carefully, "Mrs. Hale used to bake on Thursdays." Clara kept her hands moving in the dough. "I'm not baking on a schedule," she said. "I'm baking because there's nothing in this house to eat for breakfast." Hector stood in the doorway for another moment. Then something settled in his expression. A decision, she thought, about what to make of her. "Fair enough," he said. He went to the table and sat down to wait for the coffee. Ezekiel came down at 6. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the same way Hector had, arrested by something he hadn't expected to find there. The smell of bread, probably. Or just the sight of someone moving with purpose through a room that had been without purpose for a while. He sat at the table. She put coffee in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. "Emily's up," he said. "I'll make her something in a minute. She usually just has—" "I know what children need for breakfast, Mr. Hale." He looked at her over his coffee cup. She had her back to him, moving between the stove and the prep table. A long pause. "Ezekiel," he said finally. She turned. "I beg your pardon?" "You can call me Ezekiel." He didn't look entirely comfortable saying it. "Mr. Hale is what people call me when they want something." Clara considered that. "All right, Ezekiel." Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment in her nightgown, hair in 2 tangled braids, looking at Clara with the tentative hope of someone who wants to ask a question but isn't sure it will be received well. "Can I help?" Emily asked. "Mama used to let me help." The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped. Clara felt Ezekiel go very still behind her. She turned to Emily and said easily, without hesitation, "I'd like that. Come over here and I'll show you what to do." Emily crossed the kitchen in her bare feet and stood beside Clara at the prep table, and Clara showed her how to check the bread, press the top gently, listen for the hollow sound. And Emily pressed the dough with her small, serious finger and looked up at Clara for an assessment, and Clara said, "Almost. Give it 5 more minutes." Behind them, she heard Ezekiel's chair shift on the floor. She didn't turn around. She kept her attention on Emily. The first week was an exercise in endurance. There were things she had not anticipated. The weight of the water pails from the well. She built up blisters on both palms by Wednesday and wrapped them with strips of an old flour sack and said nothing about it. The cold inside the house at night, which was not like any cold she'd experienced in the boarding houses back east, a penetrating cold that got into the bones. The way the wind came down off the ridge without warning, rattling every loose thing and finding every gap in the exterior walls. The way time moved differently here. In the city, there were clocks and schedules and the sound of other people structuring your day around their own movements. Out here, the day was structured by the animals and the weather and the light, and if you didn't learn that rhythm quickly, everything went wrong at once. She learned it. She was a fast learner when she had no choice. She made a list of repairs the house needed. She had identified 17 distinct problems by day 3, and left it on the kitchen table without comment. Ezekiel found it, read it, set it down, and the following Saturday she found Hector on the porch, replacing the sagging boards without being specifically asked. She didn't say anything about that either. Caleb remained her most significant obstacle. He was not cruel. He was something more sophisticated than cruel. He was distant in the deliberate way of someone who had decided that distance was his best defense. He said good morning when he came down to breakfast because he had been raised with manners, and his manners were apparently stronger than his resentment. He responded to direct questions with direct answers, but he never initiated conversation, never sat near her if he could help it, and left every room she entered with an excuse that was just barely plausible enough that she couldn't reasonably call him on it. She didn't push. She kept her own counsel, did her work, paid attention to what Caleb valued and what mattered to him without making it obvious that she was paying attention. He loved the horses with a ferocity that was almost painful to observe. Every afternoon after his chores were done, he was in the barn. She could hear him from the kitchen window, talking to them, low and continuous, the way people talk to animals they trust more than people. One afternoon at the end of her first week, she came out to the barn to return a harness Hector had asked her to fetch. Caleb was in the third stall with a gray mare that had a favor in her right foreleg, kneeling in the hay and running his hands down the horse's leg with a practiced attention that made her look considerably older than 12. He looked up when he heard her. "Hector needs the bay harness," she said, moving along the wall to where the harness hung, not moving toward him. "Third peg," he said. She took the harness off the peg. She could feel his eyes on her back. "Her name is Mabel," he said. He hadn't needed to say it. She hadn't asked. She turned. "She favoring that leg?" He looked briefly surprised, then suspicious of the surprise. "Little bit. She does that when the weather changes. My father had a gelding that did the same thing. He used a poultice, comfrey and lard mostly. Worked better than anything the vet ever gave him." Silence. Caleb looked back at the horse. "I know the comfrey poultice." "I know you do," she said. "I just thought it was worth mentioning." She left him there. She didn't look back. It wasn't warmth what passed between them in that moment. It wasn't a turning point, but it was something. The smallest possible acknowledgement that they might, eventually, be able to be in the same barn without pretending the other one wasn't there. Oh, on the 9th day, Ezekiel asked her to ride out with him to check the north fence line. She said yes before she'd fully thought it through, which was how she found herself on horseback for the first time in 2 years, on a brown quarter horse named Buck, who was considerably less forgiving of her uncertainty than her father's old gelding had been. Ezekiel rode ahead and occasionally dropped back and said practical things about the fence and the property lines and the various reasons sections of the upper pasture were unusable in certain weather. She listened and asked useful questions, and tried to appear entirely comfortable on horseback, which she was not quite yet, though she would be again. It was a matter of recalibrating, not of learning from scratch. At one point he reined in his horse at the top of the ridge, and she came up beside him, and they sat for a moment looking out over the valley below. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the rock faces to the west, turning them copper and ochre and a deep bruised red, and the whole scope of the Hale land spread below them, down to the creek and back up the far slope to the timberline. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant it entirely, which surprised her a little because she hadn't expected to mean it. Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. "My father built the ranch from nothing," he said. "Came here with $40 and a wagon. Spent 30 years on this land." He paused. "I spent my whole life watching him hold on to it, and now I can't figure out how he did it." Clara looked at the valley. "What do you mean?" "Debt," he said. "2 bad seasons. I borrowed against the cattle in spring and the prices dropped in July." He didn't look at her. His jaw was tight, and he was looking at the land with something that was equal parts love and exhaustion. "I should tell you that. Before this goes further, you should know what you walked into." She was quiet for a moment, then, "How bad?" "Bad enough that Vernon Crow made an offer on the south pasture last month. He said the name like it tasted wrong. I told him no, he'll come back. And if he comes back, I tell him no again." He finally looked at her, and there was something hard and direct in his expression. The look of someone who needs you to understand something without softening. "This might not work out the way you were hoping, the arrangement." "I wasn't hoping for anything specific," Clara said. "I was hoping for honest work and fair treatment. You haven't violated either of those yet." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without blinking. "All right," he said eventually. They rode back down the ridge in the fading afternoon light, and she was sore all the way to her bones from the unaccustomed riding, and the wind was picking up again in the way it did in the early evenings here, and the lights of the ranch house were already glowing amber in the valley below. It was not yet a home, she knew that. She had no illusions about timelines or about the distance that still existed between herself and every other person on this property. But she kept riding. That was the only thing, in the end, that she knew how to do. She kept riding. 3 weeks into her life at the Hale Ranch, Clara went into town for the first time alone. Ezekiel had given her a short list: flour, salt, lamp oil, a spool of heavy thread, and the use of the small wagon and the brown mare, whose name was apparently Dottie, and who had a habit of veering left whenever her attention wandered. Clara had managed her well enough on the dirt road between the ranch and Red Hollow, arriving at the general store just past 9 in the morning, when the town was in its first real movement of the day. She had known, in the abstract, that people would look at her. Small towns were the same everywhere in that particular way. A new face was both an event and an opportunity, and the interest wasn't always friendly. She had prepared herself for curiosity. She had not quite prepared for Margaret Hollis. Margaret Hollis was the wife of the man who owned the dry goods store. A tall woman, somewhere in her late 40s, with a permanently erect posture and the careful smile of someone who had learned to deliver unkindness with perfect social deniability. She was standing near the bolts of fabric when Clara came in, talking to another woman Clara didn't yet know, and she turned when the door opened with the bright attentiveness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. "You must be the new Mrs. Hale," Margaret said, with a warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We've all been so curious." "Clara Whitmore," Clara said, because she was not yet Mrs. Hale in any real sense, and she was not going to claim a title she hadn't earned. "I'm staying at the Hale Ranch." Something flickered in Margaret's expression, a small recalibration. "Of course." She turned slightly toward her companion. "Dorothy, this is the young woman Ezekiel sent for, from back east." She said back east the way some people said overseas, as a polite indicator of foreignness. "She's come to help manage the house." Dorothy was a round-faced woman with kind eyes that were currently doing their best not to show that they were actively assessing Clara from hem to hairline. "How lovely," Dorothy said, with slightly more genuine warmth than her companion. "Are you settling in all right? The ranch can be quite a shock if you're not used to the country." "I'm managing fine, thank you." "It must be such a change," Margaret said, picking up a bolt of blue fabric and examining it with the focused attention of someone who is actually thinking about something else entirely. For a young woman from the city, I mean, to come all this way, and to step into a house with 2 children already. She let the sentence hang unfinished in a way that was worse than finishing it would have been. Clara looked at her steadily. Children are a joy at any age, she said. Emily especially. She's a remarkable little girl. Margaret set the fabric down. Poor Ruth. She loved those children so much. It's a difficult thing, isn't it, to fill that kind of absence? I'm not trying to fill an absence, Clara said. Her voice was level. I'm trying to make the house run. Those are different things. Margaret's smile remained perfectly in place. Of course they are, dear. Clara bought her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, paid for it with the household money Ezekiel had given her, and walked back out to the wagon without hurrying. She loaded the supplies into the back, untied Dottie from the post, and climbed up onto the bench. She sat there for a moment before she picked up the reins. She allowed herself exactly that, a moment. Then she clicked her tongue at Dottie and headed back toward the ranch. The road home was long and empty, and she stared at the horizon and thought about nothing in particular for a while. And when she got back to the ranch, she put the supplies away and went out to the yard and split a large pile of kindling that didn't strictly need splitting yet, working with a focused efficiency that had very little to do with the kindling. Hector found her there about 20 minutes in, took one look at her expression, and wordlessly picked up the second axe and started splitting beside her without saying a word. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. The town, she understood now, had already made up its mind about her. Or at least part of the town had. The part that had known Ruth Hale, had loved her or claimed to love her, and had appointed itself the custodian of her memory. Claire had been tried in absentia before she ever stepped off that stagecoach, and the verdict had been delivered somewhere between poor orphan and desperate opportunist, and nothing she did or said in the general store was going to change that verdict today. That was fine. She wasn't here for Margaret Hollis. She was here for Emily, who had started saving her the heel of the bread loaf because she had noticed Clara preferred it. She was here for the horses, who didn't care where she came from. She was here because the alternative had been worse. And she was still here, which was the thing that mattered. The kindling pile grew impressively large before she finally put the axe down. The cold deepened through November the way cold in that country did. Not gradually, but in sudden drops. As though the temperature had stairs, it was descending in the dark while everyone slept. Clara woke one morning in the 3rd week of the month to find ice on the inside of her bedroom window and her breath visible in the room, and she added another layer under her coat and went to build the kitchen fire, and decided in the pragmatic way she'd been deciding things for the past several weeks that she needed warmer clothes and that she would make them herself rather than spend the household money on them. She had found Ruth Hale's sewing basket on the second shelf of the linen closet, a wicker basket with a red cloth lining, holding needles and thread, and a small pair of scissors worn smooth on the handles from years of use. She had hesitated over it for a long time the first time she found it. It was not her basket. The scissors had the shape of someone else's hand in them. But there was no other sewing basket in the house, and Clara's coat was thin, and practicality eventually overcame the particular discomfort of using a dead woman's things. She sat by the fire in the evenings and mended and altered and constructed, taking in seams on a coat she found hanging in the hall closet that was too large to be hers but could be made to work, reinforcing the knees on Caleb's winter trousers that had worn through, letting down the hem on Emily's dress to a more appropriate length. It was invisible work in the sense that nobody commented on it, but it was the kind of work that kept things from getting worse, and she had decided early on that her role in this household was less about transformation than about arrest, stopping the slow deterioration before it became irreversible. Caleb noticed the trousers when she set them outside his bedroom door one morning, freshly mended and folded. He came down to breakfast and looked at her across the kitchen without saying anything, and she was pouring coffee and didn't make it into a moment, and eventually he sat down and ate his breakfast. That afternoon he came into the kitchen while she was kneading bread and set 3 onions on the prep table without comment. She looked at the onions, then at him. "From the root cellar," he said, looking somewhere past her left shoulder. "Back corner. There's more back there that need using before they go bad." "Thank you, Caleb." He left immediately, the way he always did, and she stood with her floury hands and her aching knuckles and allowed herself a small private recognition of what had just happened. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't warmth. It was 3 onions from the root cellar, delivered by a boy who had decided, apparently, that she was at least minimally worth the effort of 3 onions. She would take it. Ezekiel was a harder problem in a different way than Caleb was. Caleb's resistance was made of grief and loyalty, which were things she understood and could work around. Ezekiel's distance was something more complicated, layered and structural, built from a longer history than she had access to. He was not unkind to her. He answered her questions, included her in decisions about the household, deferred to her judgment on things that fell within what he apparently considered her domain. But there was a quality to the way he moved through the house when she was in it, a careful, measured quality. Like a man navigating around furniture he was afraid of bumping into, that told her he was working very hard to maintain a distance he had decided was necessary. She didn't push on it. She watched him instead, the way she watched all of them, paying the kind of attention that people mistake for patience, but is actually more like cartography, mapping the terrain before you decide how to cross it. She learned that he was up every day at 4:30, regardless of the weather, that he drank his coffee standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn with an expression that had nothing satisfied in it, that he went quiet in the evenings in a specific way that was different from his everyday quiet, heavier, slower, and that this happened most consistently on Fridays, though she didn't yet know why Fridays specifically. She learned that he was harder on himself about the ranch's problems than he was on anyone else, which was both admirable and inefficient. She learned that he was capable of warmth. She saw it with Emily sometimes, a sudden unguarded tenderness that crossed his face and was gone almost before you could register it, like a match struck in a dark room. She learned that he had read every book on those shelves in the main room, most of them more than once. One evening in late November, she came into the main room and found him sitting by the fire with a book he wasn't reading. He was just holding it, looking into the fire, and he didn't hear her come in, which meant she had a few seconds of seeing him without the careful neutrality he wore when he knew he was being observed. He looked exhausted, deeply, fundamentally tired in the way that sleep didn't fix. She almost said something. She almost sat down in the chair across from him and said, plainly, "You don't have to be all right for my benefit, you know." But the words felt too presumptuous, too much of an intrusion into a grief that wasn't hers to name or to touch. And so she went back to the kitchen instead and left him alone with his fire. It was the right call. She thought about it afterward, and she was fairly sure it was the right call, though she wasn't entirely sure. The worst week came in early December. It started with a broken water pipe in the back of the barn. The cold had finally found it, and spread from there in the way that problems on a stretched, underfunded ranch tended to spread, one thing pulling loose and then the next. The pipe took 2 days to repair properly, and in that time 2 of the water troughs froze solid, and 3 cattle that had been pushed too far from the main herd wandered through the broken south fence and had to be retrieved from a neighboring property, a retrieval that cost half a day and an uncomfortable conversation with the neighboring rancher who had his own grievances about the state of Ezekiel's fence lines. Clara managed the house through all of it without collapsing any part of it, kept the kitchen running, kept Emily distracted and warm, coordinated with Hector about the trough situation when Ezekiel was occupied with the cattle. But by Thursday evening, she was running on very little sleep and had a headache that had been sitting behind her left eye since Tuesday, and she was standing at the kitchen sink washing the supper dishes when she dropped a bowl. It didn't break. It clattered on the stone floor, and she picked it up, and she stood there holding it for a moment with her eyes closed, just breathing. "You should sit down." She opened her eyes. Ezekiel was in the kitchen doorway. "I'm fine," she said, and put the bowl on the shelf. "You've been running since before dawn." "So have you." "I'm used to it." "I'm learning," she said, and picked up the next dish. He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him cross to the other side of the kitchen, heard the sound of a chair being moved. "I'll finish those," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was standing at the basin with his sleeves already being rolled to the elbow, which she found so unexpected that she couldn't immediately form a response. "You don't need to—" "I know how to wash a dish, Clara." She watched him for another second. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and braced her elbows on it and pressed her fingers to her temples, and he washed the remaining dishes with the efficient, slightly imprecise method of a man who didn't do it often but wasn't incompetent about it. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire ticked. The wind moved around the eaves. "Fridays," she said finally, without particularly planning to. He didn't stop washing the dish in his hand, but she felt the slight shift in the quality of his silence. You go quiet on Fridays, she said. More than usual. I've been trying to figure out why. A long pause. Ruth died on a Friday, he said. Last March. She sat with that. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for noticing. He set the last dish on the drying rack and dried his hands without turning around. She was sick for a long time before the end. The children thought she was getting better. I knew she wasn't. He stopped. That's the part I can't get past. That I knew, and I let them believe otherwise because I didn't know how to tell them. Clara didn't say anything. Sometimes the most respectful thing was not to fill the silence. Caleb figured it out afterward, Ezekiel said, that I'd known. He didn't say so directly, but he knew. Kids understand more than you think they do. He finally turned around and his face was closed off again, the mask back in place, though it was sitting slightly less perfectly than it usually did. I tell you this because you're going to be around my children, and there are things about how this family got damaged that you should understand if you're going to be any help to them. I appreciate you telling me, she said. He nodded once, picked up his coat from the hook, and went out to do the final barn check the way he did every night. She heard the door close, heard his steps cross the porch, heard the yard go quiet. She sat at the table for a few more minutes, alone in the warm kitchen, and thought about what it cost a man to say something like that, the particular precise cost of it. She put it away carefully, the way you put away information that matters. 2 days later, the first real snow of winter came down from the north and covered everything. Emily came to find her the moment she saw it out the window, grabbing her hand and pulling her to look as if Clara might have missed it. And the snow was falling in the heavy, committed way that meant it intended to stay. And Emily stood at the glass with her nose almost touching it and said with perfect seriousness, "Do you think it will snow enough to make a rabbit?" A rabbit? A snow rabbit. Mama used to make them. You make a ball, and then a smaller ball, and then you put sticks for the ears. Emily turned from the window. Do you know how? Clara looked at the yard filling up with white. She thought about the pipe that had already broken once, and the fence that still needed work, and the 6 other things on the list she'd been maintaining in her head since the bad week began. I know how, she said. Put your coat on. They were outside for 45 minutes. Emily's snow rabbit was lopsided and had ears of wildly unequal length, and its head was slightly too large for its body, and Emily was entirely delighted with it. Caleb appeared on the porch halfway through the construction, hands in his pockets, watching with the expression of a boy who was trying very hard to appear indifferent to a snow rabbit, and was not entirely succeeding. The left ear's too short, he said. I know, Emily said. I told Clara, but she says it has character. It looks like it's been in a fight. All the best rabbits have been in fights, Clara said, pressing a stick ear in more firmly. Come down here and fix it if it bothers you that much. Caleb stayed on the porch for another few seconds. Then he came down the steps and crouched in the snow beside the rabbit and adjusted the ear with the focused precision of a boy who cared too much about things he pretended not to care about, and Emily watched him and offered commentary. And Clara sat back on her heels in the snow with cold hands and something shifting slow and careful inside her chest. She didn't name it. It was too early to name it. But it was there. The snow had been on the ground for 3 days when Ezekiel came to find her in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon and said, without preamble, I want to talk to you about something. She was hemming a curtain and she set it down and looked at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands, an unusual thing, the hat off inside. And something in his posture told her this was going to be a different kind of conversation than they'd had before. There's a wagon, he said, runs east to Abilene the last Sunday of every month. A man named Forsyth runs it. He takes passengers. He was looking at her with the direct, careful look she had come to recognize as his version of honesty, unornamented, slightly uncomfortable for him to sustain. I want you to know that if you've decided this isn't what you want, that wagon is an option. I have enough put aside to pay the fare and cover your expenses back to wherever you came from. He paused. I'd have told you this sooner, but I wanted to wait until you'd seen enough to make a real decision rather than a frightened one. Clara looked at him for a long time. Outside, she could hear Emily in the yard talking to the snow rabbit, which had survived 3 days and was beginning to lean slightly to the left. She thought about the cold room with the window that rattled, the blisters on her palms, Margaret Hollis's permanent smile, the 17-item repair list, Caleb's careful, furious silences. Fridays. She thought about Emily's cold hand in hers in the snow. 3 onions on the prep table. A man washing dishes in the kitchen because she was tired. "I don't want the wagon," she said. Ezekiel was very still. "I'm not saying that because I have nowhere else to go," she said, because she needed him to understand the distinction. "I'm saying it because I've decided. I'm staying because I want to stay." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something moving beneath the surface of it, something she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when things had been decided and there was nothing further to say about them. He put his hat back on and went outside. Clara picked up the curtain and continued hemming it, and her hands were steady, which surprised her a little. She had made her choice with her eyes open, which was the only way she knew how to make a choice. Whatever came next, she had walked into it willingly. And in this particular country, in this particular winter, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The snow rabbit lasted 11 days before it finally collapsed into a shapeless mound in the yard. And by then the weather had turned into something that made that first snowfall look like a suggestion. December in the Red Hollow Valley was not a gentle thing. Clara had grown up with eastern winters, wet and gray and occasionally bitter, but contained within a certain expectation, a certain understanding between the weather and the people who lived in it. What came down off the northern ridges in the second week of December was something different in character, not just cold but hostile. A wind that found the gaps in walls that had held fine for years, that pushed under door frames and through the chinking between the logs, that made the whole house sound like it was under a kind of low, continuous siege. Ezekiel spent 3 days reinforcing the barn before it hit. New boards across the north face, extra rope on the hay bales, the 2 weakest horses moved into the closer stalls. Hector worked beside him without being asked, which was the way things generally operated between those 2 men. A working understanding built over years that didn't require much conversation. Clara watched them from the kitchen window while she was cooking and thought, not for the first time, that there was a specific kind of male competence that expressed itself entirely in physical preparation and never in spoken acknowledgement of the thing being prepared for. She prepared in her own way. She made 4 extra loaves of bread and wrapped them in cloth. She moved the root vegetables from the cellar to the kitchen where the temperature was more manageable. She found every extra blanket in the house, there were 7 in various states of usefulness, and aired them and folded them and stacked them at the end of each bed. She showed Emily where they were. "Why are we getting all the blankets out?" Emily asked. "Because it's going to get very cold," Clara said. "How cold?" "Cold enough that we're going to want everything close by." She tucked the last blanket around Emily's narrow shoulders like a demonstration. "Have you been through a bad winter here before?" Emily thought about it. "Mama said last year was bad, but I was little." "You're bigger now." Emily considered this evaluation seriously. "A little bigger," she conceded. The blizzard arrived on a Thursday night without the courtesy of gradually increasing. It came from nothing, a clear cold afternoon that turned, between 6 o'clock and 7, into a wall of white moving out of the north. By 8, the visibility beyond the porch had dropped to almost nothing. By 9, you couldn't see the barn. Clara lay in her room that first night, listening to the sound of it and understanding in her bones that this was a different category of event than anything she had managed before on this ranch. The walls creaked. The window in her room, the one that had always rattled, shook steadily in its frame, and the cold pressing through the glass was palpable from 3 feet away. She got up at 2 in the morning because she could hear something in the main room. She found Emily curled in the chair nearest the fireplace with a blanket pulled to her chin, awake, eyes wide, listening to the storm. "Come here," Clara said, and sat in the chair and let Emily fold herself into her lap without making a production out of it. She stoked the fire, and Emily eventually slept, and Clara sat with the child's weight against her and watched the fire and listened to the wind work at the house and thought about everything that could go wrong. The livestock, the water, the food stores, the temperature in the house if the firewood ran low. She had already been through the firewood situation in her head, twice. They had enough for 8 days if she was careful. She would be careful. She had not gone through the scenario of Caleb disappearing in the blizzard because she had not thought it was a scenario she needed to consider. Caleb was 12 and practical and had grown up in this country and knew better than to go outside in a whiteout for anything short of catastrophe. She had not considered adequately what Caleb would define as catastrophe. The second full day of the storm, the wind dropped enough by mid-morning to allow limited visibility, 20, 30 feet at best. The world reduced to a swirling white approximation of itself. Ezekiel and Hector went out to check on the livestock, moving between the house and the barn by holding the guide rope Ezekiel had strung between the two structures before the storm hit. Clara watched them go from the kitchen window, tracking the dark shapes of them until they disappeared into the white. Caleb was supposed to be upstairs. She had checked on him 40 minutes earlier, and he had been in his room, reading, looking bored and restless in the way that 12-year-old boys in confined spaces tended to look. She was in the kitchen making soup when she heard the back door. She came into the back hallway and found it empty, found the door closed but with a thin line of fresh snow blown against the inside threshold. She stood there for 3 full seconds. Then she went upstairs and opened Caleb's bedroom door. Empty. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. And she could see through his bedroom window a single set of footprints in the snow of the side yard that the wind was already working to fill in, heading toward the east side of the barn. Clara went back downstairs with a controlled speed that was not quite running. She was pulling on her coat and her heaviest boots before she'd fully decided what she was doing, working the buttons with fingers that were already clumsy from the cold coming through the back door. Later she would think about this moment. The exact second the decision was made, and the fact that there was no real decision, that her body simply started moving before her mind had finished the calculation. She would think about whether that was instinct or something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. At the time, she was just moving. She went out the front door rather than the back, because the front door opened toward the guide rope, and she grabbed the rope with both hands and followed it toward the barn. The cold was a physical assault, not just temperature, but the wind behind it, driving ice crystals horizontal, finding the gap between her collar and her jaw, making her eyes tear immediately in a way that was pure physiological reaction with nothing emotional in it. She got the barn door open and fell inside and stood for a moment in the comparative shelter of the barn interior, breathing, letting her eyes adjust. "Caleb!" Her voice came out rougher than she intended, already half swallowed by the noise of the storm against the roof. The horses moved in their stalls, disturbed, anxious, registering the change in the atmosphere the way horses did. She counted them automatically. All present. She moved down the line and got to the third stall on the east side and found it empty, its door hanging open. Sable, Caleb's horse. A 4-year-old black gelding with a tendency toward anxiety in loud weather that Caleb had been working with all fall, with a patience that exceeded anything he showed toward people. She put it together in seconds. Sable had panicked. Caleb had gone in to calm him, and somehow, either the horse had broken out or Caleb had tried to move him somewhere and lost his grip. Sable was gone, and Caleb had gone after him. She went back out into the storm. She found Caleb's tracks on the east side of the barn, already half obscured but still readable, heading northeast, away from the guide rope, away from the house, into open country. She stood at the corner of the barn with the wind trying to take her off her feet and looked at those tracks and understood that she had, at most, 15 minutes before they were gone entirely. She followed them. What came next was the part she would have difficulty recounting clearly afterward, not because she couldn't remember it, but because the physical reality of it resisted orderly narration. It was cold and white and loud, and she was alone in it, without a rope or a guide or any means of communication, moving through snow that was in places to her knee, following marks that kept disappearing and reappearing and sometimes required her to stop completely and turn in a slow circle and find them again before she could go on. She called Caleb's name every 30 seconds. The wind took her voice and scattered it, and she had no idea whether it was carrying any distance at all. She had gone perhaps a quarter-mile from the barn. She thought she had no real way to measure it, when the land dropped away in front of her into the shallow creek gully that ran along the northeast edge of the Hale property. She knew this gully. She had ridden past it in October with Ezekiel. In October, it had been a gentle depression with a thin stream at the bottom and a stand of cottonwoods along the bank. Now it was a white trench with a frozen stream at the bottom, and a horse standing chest-deep in a snowdrift on the far bank, reins tangled in the cottonwood branches, making a low, terrified sound that she could hear even over the wind. And Caleb was at the bottom of the gully, half sitting and half lying against the bank, holding his left leg, his face white in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She slid down the bank more than she descended it, caught herself on a cottonwood root, got to him. "Caleb." She grabbed his shoulder and he looked up at her, and in his face was a 10-year-old instead of the almost grown boy he usually wore, raw and scared and fighting not to show it, which somehow made it worse. "Where are you hurt?" "Ankle," he said through his teeth. "Went down the bank wrong. I don't think it's broken. I tried to get up and—" He stopped. "How did you find me?" "Tracks." She was already looking around, assessing. The creek bank was minimal shelter. The horse was 40 feet away on the other bank, still pulling at the tangled reins. The snow on the west side of the gully was shallower. The bank provided some windbreak. Not much. Some. "Can you put weight on it?" "I don't know. Maybe. We need to move." She pulled his arm over her shoulders and got under him, and he was heavy in the way that surprise heaviness hits you. She had not accounted for how much of his father's size he already carried, and her knees bent under the combined weight, and she straightened them with the sustained effort of someone who has decided they are not going to let their knees fold under any circumstances. Up. He came up, putting weight on the ankle and making a sound that told her immediately the ankle was worse than maybe. She adjusted her grip. "We're not going to make it back to the barn in this," she said, and she said it flatly, matter-of-factly, because panic was a resource expenditure they couldn't afford. "There's an old trapper cabin on the north edge of your father's property. Do you know it?" Caleb was breathing hard. "About half a mile, east-northeast." "Yes." He looked at her. "It's not much of a cabin. It has 4 walls and a roof. The roof leaks." "Caleb," she said, "half a mile, east-northeast. We're going." He went. What she would remember afterward was not the heroic version of that walk. She would remember how many times she almost fell. Twice. Seriously, once going down to one knee in the snow and having to drag them both back upright. She would remember how Caleb's weight against her shoulder became a specific grinding pain somewhere around 20 minutes in. She would remember losing the direction twice when the wind shifted and having to reorient from nothing, from pure instinct and the memory of a landscape she had only seen once in favorable weather. She would remember Caleb, to his absolute credit, not complaining once, breathing hard, limping badly, leaning on her with a dependency that she could tell was costing him something in pride, but not complaining, not panicking, moving when she told him to move. "Tell me about Sable," she said at some point, talking to keep him focused, talking to keep herself focused. "He hates storms," Caleb said. His voice was tight with pain and effort. "He's been getting better, but today, I heard him in the barn from my room. He was making the sound he makes when he's really gone. I thought I could calm him down before Dad came back in and found him worked up." "You should have gotten your father." "I know." A pause. "I didn't want him to think I couldn't handle it." Clara said nothing to that for a moment. Then, "That's a feeling I understand." Caleb looked at her sideways from the corner of his eye. A quick, involuntary assessment, as if she had said something he hadn't expected her to be capable of understanding. They didn't talk much after that. The cabin materialized out of the white when she had nearly stopped trusting her own navigation, a dark shape against the snow that resolved itself into 4 timber walls and a low roof and a door that opened inward, blessedly, because there was drift against the outside of it that would have sealed it shut otherwise. She got Caleb inside. The cabin was dark and cold and smelled like abandonment. Old ashes, rotted wood, the specific smell of spaces that have been forgotten. But the walls broke the wind entirely, and the roof, though it had 3 visible gaps, held over the majority of the floor. There was a rusted iron stove in the corner with a short stack of wood beside it, left by whoever had last used the place. She sat Caleb against the wall, unwound her scarf and wrapped it around his hands, and went to deal with the stove. The wood was old, and the kindling was minimal, and the flint she found on the shelf above the stove was in poor condition, and it took her 11 strikes to get a spark to hold. She counted them afterward, in the way you count things when the counting is the only thing keeping you in your own body. On the 12th strike, the kindling caught, and she built the fire with the focused care of someone for whom this fire was not optional. When it was burning steadily, she went back to Caleb and looked at his ankle. He had pulled his boot off, which had been the right instinct. Swelling would have locked it on later. and the ankle was already discolored and puffed along the outer edge. She ran her fingers along the bone the way she had seen her father assess horse legs 100 times, which was not, she acknowledged, the same as knowing what she was doing, but was better than nothing. "I don't think it's broken," she said, "but it's bad. You need to stay off it." "I know." He was looking at the ankle with the grim practical interest of a boy who had grown up around animals and understood injury. Then he looked at the fire, then at her. "You didn't have to come after me." "Yes, I did." "No, I mean—" He stopped. He was struggling with something. She could see it working in his face. "You could have gone to get my father. That would have been the sensible thing. Your father was in the barn on the other side of the guide rope. By the time I reached him and he got here, your tracks would have been gone." She sat back on her heels. "I'm faster on my own." Caleb was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, the storm went on its indifferent way, pressing at the cabin walls without success. "Why do you stay?" he asked. It came out like something he'd been holding back for a long time, and the bluntness of it was not rudeness. It was the bluntness of someone who genuinely doesn't understand and has finally decided to ask. "At the ranch. I haven't been easy. Dad hasn't been easy. This whole place is—" He gestured vaguely at the leaking roof, the rusted stove, the walls of the abandoned trapper cabin that were currently their entire world. "You could go back east." Clara looked at the fire for a moment. She thought about what to say, and she decided on the truth, because they were alone in a storm, and she was tired of partial truths. "I could," she said. "Your father made that very clear, and some days I think about it." She looked at him directly. "But I looked at your sister building a snow rabbit in the yard, and your horse in that stall working hard at being better than her fear, and this whole ranch that's bent but not broken. And I decided—" She stopped. She wasn't going to make it pretty. "I decided it was worth staying for. Not because I had to, because I thought it was worth it." Caleb looked at the fire for a long time. "My mother would have stayed," he said finally. It was not a comparison. It was not an accusation. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and she understood that it cost him to say it. "I know," Clara said. They stayed quiet together after that, and it was a different quality of quiet than any they had shared before. Not hostile, not guarded, just two people who had said what needed saying and were now simply waiting out the storm in the same space. Somewhere around the second hour, Caleb's pain and exhaustion won out over his self-consciousness, and he dropped sideways against her shoulder and slept. She didn't move. She kept the fire going, and she sat with his weight against her arm, and she listened to the storm outside losing some of its force as the night deepened, the howl dropping gradually to a heavy, steady blow, and then to something less than that. And she waited. She heard the shouting before she saw the light. Men's voices, two of them, Ezekiel and Hector, calling from outside. She went to the door and opened it, and the cold came in, and she shouted back, and the light of a lantern appeared through the remaining snow, and Ezekiel came through the cabin door with the expression of a man who had been holding something together inside himself for hours by sheer force of will, and was only now allowing himself to loosen the grip on it. He went to Caleb immediately. Caleb was awake now, blinking in the lamplight, groggy, and Ezekiel crouched in front of him and put both hands on either side of his son's face and looked at him in a way Clara had never seen him look at anything. Completely unguarded, every layer of careful neutrality stripped off. He said nothing. He just held his son's face in his hands and looked at him. Caleb said, "I'm okay, Dad." Then after a pause, in a voice that Clara had to strain to hear, "She kept me warm." Ezekiel stayed crouched for another moment. Then he stood and turned to Clara, and his face was doing something complex and unresolved. And he didn't have words for it either. She could see that. He just looked at her. "Thank you," he said. The two words came out with a weight that made them mean considerably more than two words usually carried. "The ankle needs looking at," she said, because she needed something practical to say, or she was going to do something embarrassing. "I don't think it's broken, but it needs to be wrapped and rested." Ezekiel nodded. He bent and picked Caleb up, all of him, like a child half his actual size, and Clara followed them both out into the night. The storm had finally backed off. The wind was still cold but manageable, and there was a path broken through the snow by Ezekiel and Hector's approach, and Hector was waiting outside with a second lantern and the sled from the barn, and they loaded Caleb onto it and walked back toward the ranch lights. And the ranch lights were amber and steady in the dark, and Clara walked behind all of them with her hands going slowly numb in her pockets, and she looked at those lights and understood, in a way she hadn't entirely until this moment, that she was walking home. The word arrived in her mind without announcement. It surprised her. She tested it carefully, the way you test a frozen creek before you put your weight on it. Home. It held. She was still testing it, still not quite sure what to make of it, when she came through the front door into the warmth of the house, and Emily came barreling out of the kitchen in her nightgown and wrapped both arms around Clara's middle and pressed her face into Clara's coat and said fiercely, "I heard you went out in the storm. Don't do that again." Clara put both arms around the child and held her. Over Emily's head, across the room, she saw Caleb watching from where Ezekiel had set him down on the bench near the fire. He was watching her hold his sister, and something had changed in the way he looked at her. Not completely changed, not transformed, but something had been rearranged inside it. Some fundamental piece moved to a different position. He said nothing, but a few minutes later, when she went to check the fire and he was sitting closest to it, he shifted over on the bench without being asked, without any discussion, making room for her. She sat down beside him. The fire was warm and the house was whole, and the storm was done with them for now. And outside, somewhere in the dark, Sable had been found in a snowdrift on the neighboring property with nothing more than a cut on his foreleg and a considerably improved opinion of staying inside during blizzards. And Caleb Hale, who had spent 2 months treating Clara Whitmore as an intrusion he was obligated to tolerate, shifted over on a bench to make room for her. And in the morning, he would say something that would break and rebuild something in all of them. But that is its own moment. And this moment, just this, just the fire, and the warmth and the room being made, was enough. The morning after the blizzard, Caleb came downstairs on a makeshift crutch Hector had fashioned from a fence post, moving with the careful dignity of a boy who had decided that being injured was not going to interfere with his routine any more than strictly necessary. Clara was at the stove. Emily was at the table eating her breakfast with the focused efficiency of someone who had been awake since before dawn processing the previous night's events and had arrived at a state of relative equilibrium. Caleb stopped in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment, leaning on the crutch, and Clara kept her attention on the pan because she had learned over the past 2 months that direct attention made him retreat and peripheral attention gave him room to decide things on his own schedule. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Sit down. I'll bring you a plate." He came to the table and lowered himself into the chair beside Emily with the controlled wince of someone trying hard not to wince. He was quiet while she set the plate in front of him. He picked up his fork, put it down. Then he looked up at her. "I want to say something," he said, in the tone of someone who had been rehearsing since roughly 4 in the morning. "About yesterday. About everything." He stopped, his jaw moved. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong for a long time, and I knew it, but I didn't want to say so because saying so felt like—" He stopped again. "Like giving something up," Clara said. He looked at her. "Yeah, I understand that. I don't want to call you Mom," he said. He said it directly, without apology, and she respected him enormously for it. "I don't think I can do that. She was my mother, and that's—" "Caleb," Clara said, "I told you in October I wasn't going to try to be your mother. That hasn't changed." He was quiet for a moment. "But you could be something," he said. "I don't know what. Something that doesn't have a name yet." He picked up his fork again, looking at his plate. "I'd be okay with that. If you were okay with it." Clara sat down across from him at the table, which she didn't always do. Usually she ate standing, between tasks. The way you ate when eating wasn't the point of the moment. She sat down and looked at this boy across the kitchen table, this boy who had handed her 3 onions and fixed a snow rabbit's ear and come down the side of a creek bank wrong in a blizzard because he couldn't stand the idea of his horse being afraid and nobody there to help it. "I'm okay with that," she said. Emily looked between them with the expression of someone watching a negotiation conclude successfully and finding this satisfying in a deep, fundamental way. Then she said, "Can I have more bread?" And the moment became a regular breakfast again, which was exactly the right thing for it to become. Ezekiel came in from the barn during all of this, heard the tail end of none of it, took in the general atmosphere of the kitchen. Something easier than it had been, some specific tension absent that had been present every morning before, and asked no questions. He sat down, accepted his coffee, and ate his breakfast. And once he caught Clara's eye across the table and held it for a second, and something passed between them that didn't require words and that she filed away without examining too closely. The ankle kept Caleb off his feet for 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which Clara discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she actively liked him. Not in a compensatory way, not the effortful fondness of someone trying to manufacture affection toward a difficult child, but genuinely. He was sharp and observant and funny in the dry, understated way that ran in Ezekiel's bloodline, and when he dropped the armor he'd been wearing since October, he was good company. He also knew everything about the horses, more in some specific ways than Ezekiel did, because his knowledge was built from daily obsessive attention over years, while Ezekiel's was the broader knowledge of a man managing a whole operation. Clara began asking him questions, and the questions were not strategic. She genuinely wanted to know, and somewhere in the process of answering them, Caleb began explaining things to her with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting to talk about their subject of greatest interest to someone willing to actually listen. This was how, by late January, Clara had a working understanding of which horses on the Hale property had what temperaments, which were problems, and what kind of problems, and which were exceptional in ways that weren't being used. She was thinking about her father's training methods constantly by then. Had been since October, if she was honest. The methods had been in her head like a solution looking for a problem, waiting for the right moment. The right moment arrived in February in the form of Vernon Crow. She had heard the name before, from Ezekiel on the ridge in October, delivered in that particular tone of suppressed dislike. She had heard it again since in various contexts, from Hector, from the ranchers' wives in town who mentioned him with the careful neutrality of people who are afraid of someone but won't admit it. Vernon Crow owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, had been buying up struggling properties for 6 years, and had, according to everything Clara had gathered, the particular appetite of a man who understood that other people's hardship was his opportunity and saw no moral problem with that. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in the first week of February, arriving in a wagon considerably nicer than anything else on the road in Red Hollow, with a man who was apparently his lawyer sitting beside him, and the general air of someone who has already decided how a conversation is going to go and is primarily there to execute the formality of it. Clara was in the yard when he arrived, because she had been helping Hector mend the south fence and was walking back. She stopped and watched the wagon come down the drive and park, and she watched Crow get down, a heavy man in his 50s, well-dressed in the frontier way. A face that had probably been handsome once and had curdled into something harder and more calculated, and she formed her opinion of him in approximately 30 seconds. Ezekiel came out of the barn. "Crow," he said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Ezekiel." Crow's voice was the voice of a man who had practiced sounding reasonable. "Thought I'd come out and see how you're faring after that storm. Heard it hit you pretty hard." "We're fine." "Good, good. Glad to hear it." Crow glanced around the property with the particular assessment of a man trying not to appear to be assessing. His eyes moved over the repaired fence, the barn, the yard, and landed briefly on Clara before moving on. "I wanted to revisit our conversation from last fall about the south pasture." "I told you no in the fall." "You did." Crow smiled with his mouth. "But your situation's changed some since then. Those 2 bad seasons didn't get better, and carrying debt through a hard winter doesn't help." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "I've revised the offer. I think you'll find it's fair." "I don't need to read it." "Ezekiel." Crow's voice shifted. Still reasonable, but with something underneath it now, something that had more teeth. "You've got $40,000 in debt against cattle that won't recover their value for 2 years at minimum. You've got a fence line that's been failing for 3 seasons. You've got 3 working hands, including yourself, on a property that needs 6. He paused. "I'm not your enemy. I'm offering you a way out." Clara was 15 feet away. She had not moved, not because she was frozen, but because she was thinking very fast. She had been thinking very fast, actually, for about 6 weeks, since the conversation she'd had with Caleb during his 2 weeks off his ankle, when he'd shown her the breeding records his mother had apparently kept in a ledger Clara found in the bottom of the linen closet. Records going back 12 years. Records that told a story about the horses on this property that nobody had been reading correctly. She walked toward the two men. Ezekiel saw her coming and something crossed his face, a quick, reflexive concern, the expression of a man who is not sure what is about to happen and is bracing for it. "Mr. Crow," Clara said. She stopped beside Ezekiel. "I'm Clara Hale." She used the name deliberately, for the first time, out loud, to this man specifically, because she needed him to understand the structure of who was speaking to him. "I understand you're interested in the South Pasture." Crow looked at her with the particular evaluating look that some men gave to women who spoke up in conversations they considered private. He recalibrated visibly, deciding how much of his attention she warranted. "Ma'am," he said, "I was just discussing—" "I heard what you were discussing." She kept her voice even. "I want to ask you a question. Are you specifically interested in cattle grazing land, or are you interested in productive land with a reliable income stream?" Crow's eyes narrowed slightly. "Depends on the income stream." "Then you might want to know that this property has 6 horses that any competent breeding operation in the territory would consider significant acquisitions. 3 of them have bloodlines that we haven't been actively marketing. One of them—" She was thinking of the roan mare Caleb had been working with all winter, the one with the quarter-horse bloodlines that Caleb had traced back 2 generations in Ruth Hale's ledger, has a lineage that 2 ranches east of here have been trying to find for years. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ezekiel. "Your wife know horses?" "My father trained horses," Clara said, before Ezekiel could speak. "I grew up watching him build a breeding operation from 4 animals to 40 in 8 years. I know what this land can do." She gestured toward the South Pasture. "That grazing land isn't worth what you're offering Ezekiel for cattle operations because the grass runs thin by August. But for horse breeding, for year-round grazing management, for the kind of space and terrain that produces good quarter horses, that land is worth 3 times your offer, which you probably already know." Crow was very still. His lawyer, beside him, had stopped looking bored. "What I'm telling you," Clara said, "is that you're trying to buy this ranch at distressed prices before we've had a chance to use what it actually has. And I think you should go back to your own operation and leave us to ours." The silence lasted a good 5 seconds. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped. The wind moved through the yard. Crow's face went through a series of adjustments that ended somewhere between irritated and unwillingly impressed. "You've got some backbone," he said, and he meant it as a compliment with an edge to it, the kind of compliment that also carried a warning. "Yes," Clara said, "I do." Crow put the folded document back in his coat pocket. He looked at Ezekiel, who had stood through this entire exchange with his arms crossed and an expression Clara could not entirely read, and said, "Think about what makes sense, Ezekiel. The offer doesn't last forever." Then he got back in his wagon and drove away. Ezekiel waited until the wagon had cleared the property gate. Then he turned to Clara. She expected pushback. She had just inserted herself into a conversation that was not technically hers. She had made claims in front of Vernon Crow that she had not yet fully substantiated. She was aware of both of these things and had made the calculation that they were worth it, but she was prepared to defend the calculation. Ezekiel said, "Tell me what you know about breeding operations. Not who do you think you are. Not you had no right to say that. Tell me what you know." She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a while. "Let me show you the ledger," she said. She spent 3 hours at the kitchen table that afternoon explaining Ruth Hale's records to Ezekiel, who had apparently never examined them in detail. The records were meticulous, more meticulous than anyone had given Ruth Hale credit for, apparently. 12 years of bloodlines, breeding notes, temperament observations, sale prices in neighboring counties. It was a complete picture of a horse operation that had been building quietly for over a decade and had never been deliberately capitalized on. Ezekiel went very quiet going through the ledger. Clara watched him read his dead wife's handwriting and said nothing, because there was nothing useful she could say about that. "She never told me she was tracking this," he said at one point. His voice was flat, but not empty. "Maybe she was building to a proposal," Clara said. "Or maybe she just did it because she found it interesting and never got the chance to make more of it." He turned pages for a while. "You think the breeding operation is viable? I think it's more than viable." She had spread her notes out beside the ledger. She had been making notes for 6 weeks, cross-referencing Ruth's records against what Caleb had shown her, against what she remembered from her father's operation. "The valley doesn't have a dedicated quarter-horse breeding operation. There are ranches that breed as a side operation, but nobody doing it as the primary business. The demand is there. The Army contracts alone. That takes capital we don't have. We don't need much to start. We have the foundation stock already. What we need is the annual frontier auction in May. She looked at him directly. If we present 4 horses at the auction, the right 4, prepared correctly, we can establish a reputation. One good auction doesn't save the ranch, but it establishes that we're in this business seriously, and that changes the conversation with the bank. Ezekiel looked at the ledger, looked at her notes, looked at her. The auction is 3 months away, he said. I know. You'd need to work with horses you don't know. I know horses, she said, and Caleb knows these horses. Between us, we can do it. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She had learned that his silences were not resistance, they were processing, and interrupting them only slowed things down. All right, he said. She started the next morning. What followed was the hardest 3 months of her life on the ranch, and they were also, she would later think, the best. She and Caleb worked every afternoon in the paddock behind the barn, him on crutches at first, then walking carefully, then moving freely again as February turned to March. He showed her what he knew about each horse, and she showed him what she knew about training methods, and the combination of the two turned out to be considerably more effective than either would have been alone. The process was not elegant. The roan mare, whose name was Scout, and who Caleb had been right about in terms of bloodlines, had a temper that made Ezekiel suggest twice that they consider a different candidate. Clara refused both times. She understood Scout in the particular way you understand a difficult thing when the difficulty is familiar. The mare was not mean, she was mistrustful, and mistrustful and mean were not the same problem. She got thrown twice. The first time she got up, checked her elbow, and got back on. The second time she got up, checked both her elbow and her pride, and got back on. Caleb watched the second time with an expression she couldn't fully read, and afterward he said, "She's going to come around," and Clara said, "I know," and they moved on. Hector watched from the fence during these sessions with the expression of a man keeping a private ledger of his own about what he was observing. He said very little. Once, after a particularly good session with a young bay named Archer, he pushed off the fence rail and said, "Your father taught you well," and walked back to the barn, and it was the highest compliment she had received since arriving in Red Hollow. Word got out, the way things got out in small valleys. By late March, people who came through Red Hollow had heard that the Hale Ranch was presenting at the May auction. The reactions, Clara gathered from her infrequent trips to town, were mixed. Respectful from the ranching community, skeptical from the people who had been skeptical since October, and something more complicated from Margaret Hollis, who had apparently told Dorothy that it was a shame what that girl was putting Ezekiel through, making him chase an impossible scheme. Clara heard about this from Dorothy herself, who had broken away from Margaret's orbit enough by March to occasionally stop and talk when she saw Clara in the general store. Dorothy was essentially a decent woman who had spent 20 years in Margaret's social radius and had the slightly dazed quality of someone realizing gradually that the radius hadn't done her any favors. "She means well," Dorothy said, with the conviction of someone who didn't entirely believe it but wanted to. "I'm sure she does," Clara said, which was not a lie exactly. Some people meant well and caused damage anyway. That was its own category. What she did not tell Dorothy, and had not told anyone except Ezekiel, was that Vernon Crow had made a second approach in March. Not to the ranch this time, through the bank. Claire had found out from Ezekiel, who had come home from a meeting in town looking like he'd bitten into something bad, that Crow had apparently been in conversation with the bank manager about the Hale debt and had made some representation about a potential acquisition that was essentially an attempt to pressure the bank into calling the debt early. It was not legal, exactly, but it was not clearly illegal either. It was the move of a man who understood that the space between legal and illegal was where real leverage lived. Clara sat with that information for 2 days. She went back to her notes. She thought about the auction and what it could do and what it couldn't, and she thought about what it meant to be publicly making a case for the ranch's viability at an event that the entire valley attended. She thought about her father, who had faced a similar pressure from a similar man 20 years earlier and had handled it publicly in a way that had cost him some friendships, but had protected the operation. He had stood up in front of people and named the thing that was happening, and the naming had done what threats couldn't. She made a decision. She didn't tell Ezekiel about it because she was not certain he would agree, and she needed to be certain herself before she brought it to him. The May auction was held on the first Saturday of the month on the main street of Red Hollow, which was closed to wagon traffic for the occasion and lined with booths and pens and the general organized chaos of a frontier commercial event. It drew buyers from 3 counties and the surrounding territories, and it was the single most significant commercial event on the valley's calendar. Clara had been to the auction once before, briefly, in February, to understand how it worked. She had walked the line of sellers and talked to 2 ranch hands she recognized and paid attention to how the crowd moved and what it responded to. She was prepared, or as prepared as she could be, which was not the same thing as ready, but was the closest available approximation. They brought 4 horses. Scout, Archer, a gray gelding named Colonel, who was the most immediately impressive animal on the property, and a young mare Caleb had named Willa, who was not yet fully trained but whose conformation was exceptional and whose bloodlines Clara intended to make a point of publicly. The reception from the crowd was immediately better than Clara had feared and slightly worse than she'd hoped, which was about right for this valley and this context. Colonel drew attention immediately. He was visually striking and he moved well and people noticed. An older rancher from the eastern end of the valley came to look at Scout and spent 20 minutes asking Clara detailed questions about her lineage, which Clara answered in full, and she could see him doing the math and arriving at conclusions she had already arrived at weeks earlier. Crow arrived at 10 in the morning, which she had expected. He came with 3 men from his operation and moved through the auction with the proprietary ease of someone who had attended every one of these events for 15 years and considered the auction floor his natural domain. He saw the hale horses. He saw the crowd around Scout. He said nothing immediately, but she watched him stop and speak to 2 other ranchers in low tones, and she watched their expressions change in a specific way, and she understood that whatever he was saying was not about the horse's merits. She had been watching for this. She was ready for this. At noon, the auction moved to open presentation. Ranchers could address the assembled buyers and make their case for their animals before the bidding officially opened. It was informal, conversational. Most ranchers kept it brief. Clara waited until Crow had finished speaking about his own stock. Then she walked to the center of the street with her heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest that she chose to interpret as useful adrenaline rather than fear, and she started talking. She talked about the horses. She talked about the bloodlines and the valley's gap in dedicated breeding operations and the army contracts that were currently going to operations 200 miles east that could be coming here. She talked about Ruth Hale's breeding records and what 12 years of careful documentation revealed about the potential of this specific herd. She talked with the technical fluency of someone who had done the work, and she saw it landing. She could see it in the crowd's body language, in the way attention was being paid. Then she said, clearly and without heat, that she understood there had been some communication between a neighboring operation and the bank regarding the Hale debt, and that she wanted the valley to know that the Hale Ranch was not in the distressed position that communication might have implied. The silence that fell was specific and pointed. She saw Crow's face from across the crowd. He was very still. "We're not asking for anything from this valley except fair consideration at auction," she said. "Same as everyone else standing here today. And I think that's what we'll get." She walked back to where Ezekiel was standing. He looked at her. She couldn't tell, for a single terrible second, what was in his face. Then he said, quietly, "You could have told me you were going to do that. Would you have let me?" A pause. "Probably not. That's why I didn't tell you." He looked at the crowd, which had shifted perceptibly. Several of the ranchers she recognized as Crow's usual allies were now talking among themselves with the contained urgency of people recalibrating. Crow himself had moved to the edge of the crowd and was speaking to his lawyer with a tight, controlled expression. "That was either very smart," Ezekiel said, "or we just made an enemy we couldn't afford." "We already had that enemy," Clara said. "The difference is now everyone here knows it." Colonel sold to the eastern rancher for a price that made Hector go very quiet and then say, under his breath, a word Clara pretended not to hear. Scout sold to a buyer from 2 counties over who had been looking for her specific bloodline for 3 years. Archer and Willow went to separate buyers, both at prices that exceeded what Ezekiel had projected. They drove home in the afternoon light with the weight of Vernon Crow's anger somewhere behind them and enough in the strongbox under the wagon seat to cover 4 months of debt payments and fund the first stage of the breeding operation properly. It was not a complete victory. There were things it didn't fix and problems it didn't solve, and Crow was still in the valley and would not forget what happened in that street. Clara knew all of this. She sat on the wagon bench beside Ezekiel on the drive home and held the strongbox between her feet and thought about everything that still needed to happen. Caleb was asleep in the wagon bed behind them inside of 20 minutes, propped against the sideboard, exhausted from the day, and Emily was a warm weight against Clara's left side, also drifting. Ezekiel drove in his usual silence, but after about 10 minutes he said, not looking at her, "My father would have liked you." She looked at the road. "Because of the auction? Because you don't back up." Clara thought about her father, who hadn't backed up either, and about the cost of that. The cost was real. She knew it was real. But there were things you bought with the not backing up that you couldn't buy any other way. And the Hale Ranch still had its south pasture and its horses and its foundation for the operation that Ruth Hale's careful records had been waiting 12 years to build. She looked out at the land in the low afternoon light, the ridges going copper, the valley below them, the ranch lights beginning to show in the distance. The valley would not forget what happened at that auction. She knew that too. She was counting on it. The summer after the auction, Red Hollow changed the way it looked at the Hale Ranch. Not all at once, not with any ceremony. It happened the way most genuine changes happen. Incrementally, quietly, in the accumulation of small moments that only add up to something when you step back far enough to see the whole of them. A rancher stopping to talk at the general store about Scout's first foal. A buyer from the Eastern Territory writing to inquire about Willa's bloodlines before Willa had even completed her first breeding season. Dorothy appearing at the ranch one afternoon in June with a pie and a slightly embarrassed expression, as if she had been meaning to do this for a while and had finally run out of reasons not to. Clara let her in and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours. And it was the first real conversation Clara had in Red Hollow with someone who wasn't connected to the ranch by necessity or obligation. It was imperfect in the way that first real conversations are, slightly careful, slightly feeling out the terrain, but it was genuine, and Clara valued genuine above almost everything else. She did not hear from Margaret Hollis. She had not expected to, and had made her peace with that. Vernon Crow made one more approach in June, a month after the auction. He came alone this time, no lawyer, no wagon, rode in on a horse that was considerably finer than the occasion warranted, which Clara noted as a specific kind of statement. Ezekiel met him in the yard. Clara watched from the kitchen window, not hiding, not pretending she wasn't watching. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. She could not hear the words, but she could read the posture of both men. Crow arriving with something that was not quite conciliation, but was in that general direction. Ezekiel standing with his arms at his sides and his weight evenly distributed, which was his version of immovable. At the end of the 8 minutes, Crow got back on his fine horse and rode out the same way he'd come. Ezekiel came inside, poured himself coffee, and stood at the kitchen window. "He withdrew the pressure on the bank," he said. "What changed his mind?" He said the valley's watching and he doesn't want the reputation. He drank his coffee. He also said, and I believe this part, that someone made him an offer on his north pasture that's more interesting to him than our debt. Clara thought about that. "Are we done with him?" Ezekiel turned from the window. "I think so. For now." He paused. "You know he's never going to like you. I don't need him to like me." "No," Ezekiel said. "You don't." Something moved briefly in his expression, something she had been seeing more of in recent months, the unguarded thing that crossed his face when he forgot to be careful. "You don't need much from people, do you?" "I need the same things everyone needs," she said. "I'm just particular about which people I need them from." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his coffee down and went back outside, and she stood in the kitchen with the particular feeling of a conversation that had said more in its margins than in its actual words. She had been having a lot of those with Ezekiel lately. What was building between them had the quality of something neither of them was discussing, but both of them were aware of, a slow accumulation, not unlike the way the ranch itself had been accumulating its recovery. You couldn't point to one moment and say that's when it changed. It was the coffee at the window. It was the evenings in the main room where the silence had stopped being avoidance and become something closer to ease. It was the way he had started deferring to her judgment on the horses without making it a concession, just doing it naturally, the way you defer to someone whose knowledge you've come to trust. It was the afternoon in late June when she was trying to move a hay bale in the barn, and it slipped and she caught it badly and twisted her wrist, and Ezekiel appeared from somewhere and took the bale without comment, and then took her wrist in both hands and looked at it with the focused attention he brought to everything. Not a dramatic gesture, just a man checking if something was hurt, and held it for slightly longer than the examination required. Neither of them said anything about that. Caleb noticed, because Caleb noticed everything. He had his mother's eyes in more ways than coloring. A specific quality of observation, a capacity for paying the kind of attention most people couldn't sustain. He said nothing to Clara about it directly, but one evening in July he came to where she was sitting on the porch after supper and sat beside her without announcement and said, "You're good for him. I want you to know I think that." Clara looked at him. He was 13 now, beginning to carry his height differently, beginning to look less like a boy straining toward adulthood and more like someone who was arriving there on his own terms. "That means a lot to me," she said. "I'm not saying it to be nice," he said, in the direct way he had. "I'm saying it because it's true, and someone should say it out loud." She thought about the boy who had stood in the kitchen in October with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and told her he was not going to pretend. She thought about 3 onions on a prep table, about a boy kneeling in the snow, adjusting a rabbit's ear with the hands of someone who cared too much to let imperfection stand. "You've changed too," she said, in case no one said that out loud either. He was quiet for a moment. "I think I was—" He stopped, started again. "I think I was holding on to being angry because it felt like the only way to hold on to her. Like if I stopped being angry at everything that wasn't her, I'd lose her faster." He said this carefully, with the concentrated effort of someone working out a thought they've been turning over for a long time. "But that's not how it works." "No," Clara said. "It isn't." "She's still there," he said. "That doesn't change. It doesn't." He was quiet for another stretch, looking out at the yard where the evening light was going long and amber across the grass. "I finished the ledger," he said. "Mom's ledger. I added the new records from this year." He paused. "I thought someone should keep it going." Clara looked at him. Something in her chest did a slow, careful thing. "Your mother would have wanted that." "Would." "Yeah." He stood up. "I'm going to check on Scout's foal." He was already off the porch steps. Then he stopped and turned back, and for a second he looked exactly like his father. The same stillness, the same quality of something held and then deliberately released. "Clara, I know I said I couldn't call you anything that had a name, but—" He stopped. His jaw shifted. "Your family, however that works. Your family." He went to the barn before she could respond, which she suspected was deliberate, because he was 12 kinds of his father's son. She sat on the porch for a long time after that. It was Ezekiel who finally said the thing that needed saying, on a Sunday evening in late July, when the work of the day was done and the heat of the afternoon had broken into something bearable, and the sky to the west was doing what western skies did in summer, burning itself out in oranges and reds and a deep bruised pink that made the whole valley look briefly like something out of a painting. He came to find her on the porch. She had been sitting with a cup of tea that had gone cold, watching the light change, not thinking about anything in particular, which was a thing she had only recently relearned how to do, to simply sit and not be solving a problem. He sat in the chair beside hers. Not the chair across, the one beside. They sat for a while without talking. The sky continued its performance. A hawk came off the ridge and crossed the valley below them in a long, unhurried arc. "I want to say something," Ezekiel said finally. "All right." He looked at the sky rather than at her, which she understood was not evasion, but rather the way he talked when the thing he was saying mattered enough that he needed to not be watched while he said it. "When Ruth died, I thought that was the end of a certain kind of life, the life where there was someone. I decided that had a finite run, and it was over, and I made myself be all right with that because the alternative was being not all right with it, and I had 2 children who needed me to be functional." Clara didn't say anything. She watched the hawk. "And then you showed up," he said, which was a practical arrangement. I told myself that, and I believed it for a while. A pause. I stopped believing it sometime around February, maybe before. She turned to look at him then, even though he wasn't looking at her because she needed to see his face while he said this. "What I'm trying to say," he said, and stopped. He turned to her then. His face was doing what it rarely did. Nothing. No guardedness, no careful neutrality, just his face, open, with everything that was actually in it visible. "I don't want you to be here because it's a practical arrangement. I want you to be here because—" He stopped again, pushed through it. "Because I can't think about this ranch without thinking about you in it. I can't think about these children without thinking about you with them. And I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I do is listen for you in the kitchen, and if you weren't there—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "That's what I'm trying to say." Clara put her cold tea down on the porch rail. She had thought about this conversation, or a version of it, more times than she was going to admit out loud. She had thought about what she would feel, and what she would say, and whether she was sure, and she had arrived at sure by degrees, the way you arrive at most true things. Not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that slowly rearranged themselves into an answer. "I stayed," she said. "You offered me the wagon, and I stayed. That wasn't practicality." He looked at her. "I knew what it was," she said. "I just needed you to catch up." Something shifted in his face, something that broke open slowly, and wasn't entirely comfortable, and was one of the most genuine things she had ever seen on a person. Not relief exactly. Bigger than relief. The specific feeling of a man who has been braced against something painful for so long that when the brace is no longer necessary, his whole body doesn't know what to do with the absence of strain. He reached across and took her hand. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and he held hers like someone who was not sure they were allowed to and had decided to do it anyway. They sat like that while the sky finished burning itself out above the valley, and neither of them said anything further because nothing further was required. Inside the house, Emily was singing something tuneless and happy to herself in the kitchen. Through the barn door, left open in the summer heat, they could hear Caleb's voice, low, continuous, talking to Scout's foal the way he talked to all the horses, like they were the most reasonable conversationalists available. The foal was going to be exceptional. Clara already knew it. The bloodlines were there, and the confirmation was there, and Caleb had been working with it since the day it came into the world, with a gentleness and a patience that still surprised her when she witnessed it, though it shouldn't have stopped surprising her months ago. The operation that Ruth Hale's records had quietly anticipated for 12 years was finally becoming real. It was not large yet. It was not secure yet. There were still debt payments and still difficult seasons ahead, and still mornings when Ezekiel stood at the kitchen window with the look of a man carrying more than he wanted to let show. The ranch was recovering, not recovered. There was a distinction, and Clara held it clearly because she had learned that the gap between those two things was where you still needed to be careful. But the bank had extended their terms in June. 2 breeding contracts had come through by July. A rancher from 3 counties east had ridden out specifically to look at the foal, having heard about it from the buyer who'd purchased Scout at the May auction, and had left a deposit on next season's breeding rights, which was the kind of forward-looking investment that told you something real about a property's reputation. Hector had hired a second hand in June without being specifically asked. A young man named Thomas, who had come through Red Hollow looking for work and had been assessed by Hector over the course of 3 days and deemed acceptable, which was as enthusiastic an endorsement as Hector gave anything. Thomas was 22 and knew horses and worked without complaining and had begun to fill the gaps in the operation that had been getting by on too few hands for too long. It was not easy. None of it had been easy, and none of it was going to suddenly become easy. Clara had no illusions about that. The frontier was not a place that rewarded illusions. It found them out quickly and at cost, and she had paid enough costs in her time here to understand the terrain honestly. But there was something she had come to believe in the months since October, something she had arrived at not through any single revelation, but through the slow, insistent evidence of daily life. That staying inside a difficult thing, when you chose to stay, changed what the thing was. Not immediately, not without pain, but the choice itself, the active, eyes-open choice to remain, was a different kind of foundation than anything that came from simply having no other option. She had had other options. She had the wagon. She had had the road east at every point in the winter, before and after the storm, through every cold morning and every hard week and every Friday when Ezekiel went quiet with his grief, and every evening when Margaret Hollis's voice lived somewhere in the back of her head, reminding her what the town thought she was. She had stayed because she decided to. That was the thing she knew in her bones. And the family she had found here, or built, or both, because maybe those weren't different things, was made of the same material. Not biology, not accident, not circumstance alone. Choice, running through all of it like a structural element. Emily choosing to take her hand in the snow. Caleb choosing to make room on a bench. Ezekiel choosing, finally, to say the thing out loud instead of carrying it alone. None of them had managed it gracefully. They had all stumbled into it sideways through difficulty and resistance and the specific clumsiness of people trying to do a hard thing without a map. There had been nothing smooth or effortless about any of it. That was, she thought, exactly the point. The things that cost something were the things that held. The summer evenings settled into full dark around the porch, and the stars came out over the valley in the particular abundance of skies that had no competition from city lights. And inside the house, Emily had stopped singing and was probably already asleep, and somewhere in the barn, Caleb had finished his conversation with the foal and gone quiet. Ezekiel's hand was still in hers. His thumb moved once, slightly, against her knuckles. Not a gesture with any theatricality to it, just a small, private thing, the kind of thing that meant more than larger gestures precisely because it wasn't performing for anyone. Clara looked out of the dark valley and thought about the girl who had stepped off a stagecoach in October with a carpetbag and $43 and a list of things she would not tolerate. And she thought about the distance between that girl and this porch, and the distance was not as far as it might look from the outside. The girl had not become someone different. She had become more completely herself, which was a different thing. She had come to Red Hollow to survive. She had stayed to build something. The distinction between those two motivations was, she had come to understand, the distance between a life endured and a life actually lived. The hawk, or another hawk, it was dark now and impossible to tell, called once from somewhere on the ridge above the valley, a clean ascending sound that the dark absorbed. Clara Hale sat on her porch in the last of the summer heat, in the ranch she had chosen, beside the man she had chosen, in the life she had built from the rubble of one that had fallen apart, and she thought, this is it. This imperfect, difficult, ongoing thing. This is what she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking. Not a destination, a direction. And every morning you woke up and chose it again. That was enough. That was in fact everything.